Well, welcome to the last in our series, the OLI Online, looking at megalithic cultures. And we end with the highlights, the highlighters, the top billing places, some that you know, but others that you probably don't know. And I'm also going to instill a little wanderlust because we're going to start with incredible Ireland, which is wonderful for history, but also ancient history. Megaliths dot every part of Ireland, every kind of megalithic structure. Many of them are on mountaintops. In fact, whole villages are on the tops of some mountains. Uh, this one, part of Big Leave Mountain, the temple on the very tippy top of this limestone mountain, wonderful hiking. And Ireland is just covered with different kinds of tombs. They use a little different terminology. Most of them are dolmens and modified passage tombs, but you can see clusters, concentrations on the west coast. And some will look very familiar. This dolmen, which probably was covered at one time, this passage grave. And different types of tombs are found in different regions, and in also stone circles. I'm going to start by looking at three different areas in Ireland, uh, the Lough Crew area, and then go to the Hill of Tara and end with the River Boyne Valley. These are all very, very close to Dublin, and in fact, you can drive, it's only about 20 miles taxi drive or bus up to the center of this incredible megalithic area. Most of these, like the ones on the west coast, are on the tops of mountains, and every mound you see here is actually a passage tomb, and even the mountain in the distance is a passage tomb. This was probably uncovered. You see the passage kind of exposed. And this particular cluster of Lough Crew is called the Witches' Mountains or the Hag Mountains, Slívna Gaeli. And she was collecting giant stones for her castle, put them in her apron, and she was on her way back, took a shortcut and hopped from mountaintop to mountaintop. But in doing so, she lost stones at each top, and eventually she tumbled to her death on the last mountain. So she dropped her stones along the way. And there's so many of these passage tombs and house steads that they're just labeled, numbered, or lettered. Here in Carn L, you see a classic passage tomb with a ring of stones around it, and it's oriented so that it gets basically the equinoxes, the winter and fall equinox. On the Carbane east of the Witches' Mountains, here's Cairn T, which is unique because it gets the summer solstice, and it's surrounded by smaller barrow passage tombs. And you can see three chambers in the back. These may have been for remains, but most likely for ceremonies and also for the priests undergoing sort of sensory deprivation back there and seeing visions, which would be interpreted in one way or another. And during the solstice or the equinoxes, this would get light coming down the passage and shine on the back of the passage tomb and light up an amazing, what is called a backstone. And as the sun changes its position, the light moves and then eventually lights up the backstone. So here you can see how the light moves across this in the rear of the chamber. And additionally, there is a ceiling stone. So the top of the last chamber actually has petroglyphs. These may be, of course, things that the priest has saw in sort of a trance. And we'd love to know what these mean. They look like sunbursts, but others look perhaps like rib cages, swirls, and so on. And this is the outside. This is where the witch or the hag died. And an amazing stone on the one edge of the passage tomb looks just like a chair. And this is, who knows if they moved this here or if they built the whole tomb around it, but it's called the hag's chair. And you often see people leaving gifts and offerings. And the front of the hag's chair is also incised with very unique petroglyphs, dots, cups, wiggly lines, the things that maybe the priests saw. Also, the passage tomb has big stones that hold up the ceiling, which are called orthostats, but you notice they are decorated as well with some amazing things, including spirals. Then we go to the Hill of Tara, very nearby actually, and this is a very popular tourist area because some of these are open and it's open. The tombs are open, but the landscape is delightful for just hiking across. You see these two menhirs, or one menhir with a nearby actual historic marker. And then we go to the Boyne, the Boyne Valley along the Boyne River. And it is remarkable in terms of the attractions, the history. So on this map, we see the Loch Crew Cairns, we see the Hill of Tara, and then we come over to the other arrow and you see this bend in the Boyne River where there is a concentration of amazing passage tombs. But if you're interested in more recent history, there are castles galore, historic battlefields and cemeteries. So a fantastic place. Just get your Guinness in Dublin and head out. Here are three main passage tombs, Noth, Newgrange, and Doth. And we're going to start with Noth, which is kind of unique because it's surrounded by these barrows and miniature passage tombs. You can see the bend in the Boyne River there. Actually, the bend probably has a great deal to do with the ceremonial center because if you look carefully, you will see all kinds of depressions and circles. This is just littered with megalithic, Neolithic tombs and circles and henges. Very few of them have been excavated. One was recently excavated, and I'll show you that in a moment. But Noth goes back about a little bit older than Stonehenge. You see stairs and a passage. There's actually two passages, which is quite unique. There's also a little wood henge. This was very common. Sometimes prior to the passage tomb, they may have a ceremonial center made out of logs, erected in an upright circle. So very beautifully maintained, very inviting, a good visitor center, and lots of interpretation possible. So we're going to look at Noth. It has two passage tombs, and interestingly, the one actually gets the winter solstice or winter equinox, and the other one gets the summer solstice or equinox. They don't have the same number of chambers, but they're quite unique, and it, of course, attracts a lot of attention. And what's interesting here is that, especially in the East Passage, where there are three chambers, each of these chambers has a giant stone basin that's incised and was so big it was no doubt carved there because you couldn't get it in through the passage and the standing stones as they were originally put in place. Now, some of these early ones were actually filled with ashes from cremations and perhaps bones from cremated remains. So these are sometimes called querns, which are an Irish name for millstones. And it's not certain whether these were used to grind the bones into a dust that may have had some ceremonial significance, or it was just a reminder of the ancestors. And again, you see a backstone in this one chamber that is incised with petroglyphs. Remarkably, there are 127 stones around the edge of the north passage, and every one of them is incised with these remarkable petroglyphs that are not only enigmatic, but sometimes they actually are useful. These two, the upper one actually probably represents a lunar calendar, whereas the one on the lower right is a sundial of sorts, and probably announced when certain celebrations were to take place. So this is one of the oldest sundials we know, and there would be a little hole for the gnomon that probably had a little stick in there. Some grave goods or artifacts, it's hard to know what they were used for. This flint mace and this axe were probably prestige items. And one remarkable thing about this jadeite axe found in Eastern Ireland is that the jadeite came from the Italian Alps. So it shows there's been quite a lot of trade that went on 5,000 years ago. And here, instead of the Scottish carved balls, there are what look like marbles, stone marbles. The other passage tombs in the Bra-na-Boyne Valley actually get different kinds of solar radiation coming down the passage. So the Newgrange one gets the winter solstice, whereas the Noath gets the equinoxes, and the Douth gets the winter solstice. So quite remarkable in the alignment in this complex. Doath is kind of a strange one. It's depressed in the middle because the 18th century and later people were excavating. They didn't quite know where the passages were closed off, so they just excavated down. But here, unusually, there are multiple passages, and one case, a passage is connected to another one. But here again, you see petroglyphs along the orthostats that are holding up, making up the wall of the passages. And Newgrange, which is such a remarkable place because of the beauty, but also the scale. And it is coated on the front with quartzite, really beautiful milky quartz that were quarried some distance away. And it represents kind of a mirror. You can't miss it. No matter where you are, this is visible from a great distance away. Covered with earth, there are curbstones, but they don't have the same kind of incising. But the entrance is remarkable. And this is what it probably looked like back in the Neolithic. There is the entrance that was probably closed off. And just above the entrance is a little window box, which is also ornately carved. And then the entrance is this remarkably carved with triskel or triskelon swirls and who knows other kinds of drawings that became Celtic patterns. But what's interesting, because the passage would be closed off and the roof box would be closed off to make this a completely sense deprivation chamber, if you will, but the roof box lid could be taken off, and on few days on either side of the midwinter solstice, you would get the light coming through the roof box, going all the way down the chamber, and again hitting the backstone. Newgrange has 3 chambers. They're quite a distance in, and not surprisingly, the light will hit the very back of that chamber, where at one time there was a stone basin. One of the most remarkable carvings is one of the orthostats at the very back of the passage has this repeated triskel, the triple spiral, which may well have been a calendar for marking when the seasons have passed and when celebrations should be held. But spirals adorn most of the orthostats as they go back, and you see three different places for these stone basins. Here is one stone basin that is left in place, and Newgrange is so impressive in its scale, it also has a corbelled roof that in the back of the chamber, they built this kind of dome, which is corbelling, and it's elaborate. It allows you to have more room in the back of the chamber. The stone basin again has, in Newgrange doesn't have carvings, but it did contain ashes and bones, and people still think they may have been used to grind ceremonial grain or somehow use the ground up bones of the cremated people in some religious way. These are ancient Neolithic Iron Age millstones or querns, often with carvings in them. You would put the grain and then grind or move one stone on top of the other. More intricate and ornate grave goods, but they may not just be grave goods, they may have been sort of religious items that the priest could use in certain ways. How, we don't know, but sometimes they were carved and sometimes they were just decorations. Now this is a dramatic area, and if you want more information, you can go to noth.com, and it has all sorts of ways to connect. There's an awful lot of tourism here. You can get tours, you can get little lodges and go from place to place, and there's an awful lot of information at this website. Because it has the winter solstice, you get lots of people coming for celebrations, and you meet every kind of Irish character. And recently, another passage tomb was excavated, and here are some of the standing passage stones that are fallen over, but they likewise are covered with spirals and other things. And then this map down below is a product of ground penetrating radar and magnetometers that have found other passage tombs that have not been excavated. And then you see this circle, 2018. This was discovered during a drought in Ireland by this kind of independent researcher who was flying drones over the fields looking for depressions. And so he called this Dronehenge. And it has been excavated to the point where it didn't have stones in that pattern, but trees logs. So they generated a couple of images of what this particular Dronehenge looked like. And this was often a pattern where they would build these ceremonial henges out of wood and then later replace them with passage tombs. We will see a similar one at Stonehenge. In fact, two different wood henges at Stonehenge. These still survive in Germany in the sense of reconstructed, but quite important and many times working as astronomical observatories. Now we go, of course, to the iconic Stonehenge, which may not look like it's on a mountain, and it's not, but it's on this amazing open plain that has been treeless for a long time because of the soil. It's very shallow topsoil, and then underneath it is this chert or chalk area. It's actually chert mixed with chalk, so trees really don't grow. So here's a little diagram that shows you how far you can see from Stonehenge, but also how far you can see Stonehenge from other places as you're approaching. So this probably was very crucial in terms of this as a ceremonial center, and people would make pilgrimages here from Scotland and elsewhere, and we'll see probably even from the continent. It is a remarkable place. It's very moving. It's owned by the British people, the British Heritage Society. And when we were talking about how these were built, of course, it was Merlin who turned himself into a giant, or hired giants to move these big stones. In many cases, the story also includes that they found Merlin saw these stones in Ireland and then stole them from Ireland and brought them here. There's still animosity between the two places. Many theories of how they were built, aliens or other figures. But we must pay note to Reverend Dr. Stukely, who was the first to actually measure these and count them, and proposed that they were built by Druids. And he was classically educated and read the Gallic Wars and all the early Roman writers, and said, who described Druids around 50 BC. But Druids came much later than Stonehenge was ever built. But nonetheless, the association of Druids, which was a religious part of whoever was living there, the Iron Age people. So still we see indications that this was a place for Druid celebrations, and also because the Romans described lots and lots of sacrifices by the Druidic people. I think these were the kind of adventure writings of their day, but many of these stones were supposedly altars for human sacrifice. We'll forget that one. Well, there is a legend which you will hear all over the place if you get a guided tour or something, that if you try to count the stones and then you get a number and you start over again, it will never be the same number. The stones move. So it's a story I've heard everywhere, and I've even heard it in Turkey. So the disappearing stones or the moving stones, and it was very hard to count them. But nonetheless, these places are still celebratory for whatever reason. But it was Stukely, writing in the 1700s, who made this place really well known. Not until the railroads and Stukely's book did it become known and associated strongly with the Druidic people. But everybody would come out here. Thomas Hardy set one of his stories about it. But it has long been a curiosity. And it is still a curiosity. The road has been moved a couple of times. It's always a traffic jam going out to see this amazing place. Now, Stonehenge took almost 2,500 years to build, and the nature of the henge is reversed. That is, the ditch is on the outside. Most of the henges that were built, the ditch is on the inside. They would just shovel the dirt with reindeer antlers and other kinds of animal bones, scapula, and so on, and they would pile the dirt on the outside. In this case, they piled the dirt on the inside. It had two entrance ways. So it started as a henge, and that henge has to do with the ditch. That's the true henge. Then later, trees or logs were built, and these had to come from a great distance because they used a lot of logs. They probably had an inner circle and an outer circle just inside the berm, and then a ditch with some entrance ways. So this was took a couple of 100 years to build. And there's remnants of the initial wood henge around this. That is, there are holes called the Aubrey holes, after an early scientist who measured these, dug them up to see what was there. Quite often there would be cremation remains, cremains, that is, bones that were obviously resulted from cremating. And you see all of this, the Aubrey holes, many of them have, or more than half of them have cremains, and sometimes grave goods. So this mace, which was a beautiful structure. And the one picture you can see an excavation of one of the Aubrey holes surrounding the sarsen stones. Later, about 1,000 years later, the stones began to be moved in, and initially it was kind of gabbro and a volcanic dense diapole called bluestone, and these were brought from Wales. They're not as big, but they brought a lot of them, and they moved these around quite a bit. So initially a circle, And this bluestone, there's evidence that 80 of them originally at the monument, only a half of those remain. They were eventually located to have come from a place in Wales, the Presley Mountains, 140 miles. To think, how did you move these? Originally, the Presley Mountain bluestones were in the middle as a circle, and then later new ones were placed inside the great sarsen stones. There is a kind of business that's come up because people used to bring hammers and whack off pieces of the bluestone because it was thought to be healing. So now there's a little industry that have bought up parts of the quarries in Wales and make all kinds of gewgaws and knickknacks. You see representation of the green men there. Even you can buy a miniature Stonehenge if you want. How did they move them? 140 miles, you can see all the way over by Milford Haven. Some people think they were brought partly by boat, but either way, they had to come overland for part of the time. And there's one of my favorite towns called Hay-on-Wye, which is actually a town made up of bookstores, which is why I like it. And this is the old quarry site that was found. And you can see many of them break off. Frost action makes them into a little bit of megalithic stones to begin with. People have tried to float them, and they usually totter and fall off. People also speculated they were maybe carried underneath the boat, and all sorts of things have been tried, rollers, and then even how did these get erected, because they're still pretty heavy, about 30 tons. So there was counterweights that supposedly used for the bluestones. Not too long ago, some students from the University of London actually built a log roller, and they found out that 10 students could move one of these about 1 mile an hour. So that's 140 miles distance. Another interesting architect engineer came up with a rolling system where he grooved the wood and put balls in it so you would have ball bearings. There's no evidence whatsoever of these, or of the grooves with balls. And then about 1,000 years later, the sarsen stones slowly come in. It took at least 700 years for the sarsen stones to be moved in place and the lintels put on top. And they came, they're a silicified sandstone, and they came only about 30 miles away from Marlborough Downs, and it's not quite sure exactly where they came, but the estimates took 10 years to prepare the stones. That sounds pretty short, actually, but then another 10 years to drag them. So one of the old theories is that glaciers brought these down, which you find these kind of sandstone, what are they called? It'll come to me in a minute, erratics. That glaciers brought them down, and then when they melted in place, they would drop the stone out of their ice along with a lot of silt and debris. But this was a little bit beyond the extent of the glaciers. If you go to the visitor center, they have a stone there, about 80 tons, and you're free to move it at your leisure. How did they bring these sarsen stones 40 miles? How many people would it take? It's still unimaginable, but it was done. Now, it took 700 years to bring these stones down, so if they did 2 a year, they could have done it. How they erected them, they probably used wooden kind of platforms to hoist these up, lever them up, or maybe earthen banks to pull things up. The hard thing is getting the lintel stones on top of them. And you may notice that there's a tenon joint. That is, there's a knob on the top of the sarsen and then a matching depression and a groove. So there was a careful amount of kind of engineering that went into these stones and measuring before they could ever move the lintels on top of them. Evidence has suggested because of, you might see these kind of dead grass areas and other evidence that the Stonehenge was actually in a complete circle with lintel stones on top of every outside standing sarsen. There is what they call the death stone because they thought this had to be a sacrifice place. There is an unusual sarsen stone that's lying on the side, and it's called the altar. And then when you have these remarkable two sarsen stones with the lintel on top, these are called trilithons. And this is really the only place that they occur. Remarkably, lots of people have speculated that this wasn't open. Maybe it had a roof and you could stand on top of the tallest starsens so you could watch the sun, or maybe they were ramps. This is an architect, Sarah Eubank, who proposed that this was actually roofed in a very interesting, almost Harry Potter sort of way. Another person, Bruce Bedlam, who's a very creative engineer, he's come up with his own version of the Rubik's cube, but he's also built a possible wooden structure that may have been on top of all the stones. He also has come up with a novel idea to move the sarsen stones, and may have been used. That is, you surround the stone with planks and tie it up together and put a kind of roller on the end, like a massive rolling pin, and roll the stones. There isn't much in terms of a gradual decline from the Marlborough area. And here is the altar stone, which is unique because the sarsen stones were worked. They were smoothed out. And the bottom part that is buried in the dirt is not worked. So this is one that they sort of maybe just gave up on and left it, and lots of speculation that it was left like this so the blood would drain off after they sacrificed people. But so much speculation. It does align with the summer solstice, and not only aligns, it aligns over a couple of major stones that lie outside the Stonehenge circle, and then the sunrise meets on the back of stone 16. Also, the square demonstrates an alignment with a cycle of the moon that runs on 186 years. But some people get carried away and say that this connects with ley lines to all over the world. If you want to connect all these ley lines, people think this connects to Mount Shasta in terms of a power line. But what is interesting, that outside of the ring, there used to be two heel stones some distance away, and now there's only one left, but there's evidence that there was a second one. And these are not worked, and they haven't been moved. So people have analyzed this and found that perhaps because there was another stone somewhere along the solstice axis, that this always was an observatory for watching the summer solstice sun rise. So they built this in direct alignment with the heel stones. And now you align it over with the heel stone and then with sarsen stone 16. And indeed, it's one of the 2 days that is open to the public, that you can swarm around the stones itself, the summer solstice. And this is the heel stone. And so people they congregate around that heel stone. It's something like 120 tons and much more than the normal sarsen stones. But eventually you can see the heel stone in the distance through the trilithons, and it makes a very moving place. And that's one of the functions, of course, is to be moved by these. Now, Stonehenge is a pilgrimage ceremonial area. And Stonehenge is just one element of this. Older than the monument itself is the greater cursus, this long, what was by the Romans called a circus or a racetrack, but it was a trench and berm with some stone structures, particularly at the end, and it was probably a processional. There are additional processionals that go down to Avon River, and these were probably very ritual. Coming up from the river, which is how a lot of pilgrims came, they would move along the avenue and then approach Stonehenge. There's another avenue at the Durrington Walls, but notice how many barrows and long barrows are there, and more are being found, which is, in fact, more of everything is being found as technology gets more and more advanced. So these are some of the known round barrows, long barrows, flat graves, which once these Beaker people came in, they probably didn't usurp it, but they certainly buried people here and probably celebrated in various ways. The Romans also made a camp here for a while. This is the cursus, one of many around England, processionals. They probably, we think about carrying the shrines of the saints. Similar things probably occurred. And then you notice also round barrows around the edge. Many of these, most of them have not been excavated, although probably in the 1700s people did dig down, and you notice a little bit of a henge, not much. Recently, using ground penetrating radar, which is what the guy on the ATV is doing, and also magnetometers, they have found dozens of new buried barrows and perhaps other burials. And you also notice a circle at the top, Durrington Walls, which was another ceremonial site and probably one of the village sites for all the workers who built Stonehenge. And then you see another circle says Woodhenge. Notice these little diagram of, these are ground penetrating radar images of what kind of stones or dense dirt lies below the surface in many of these spots. Durrington Walls was recently discovered, and it turns out that there was a larger ring of circles, 5 times larger than Stonehenge. No, I'm sorry, it's 15 times larger than Stonehenge, and it's only been partially restored. And then just to the south is an excavation that shows a very elaborate wood henge. This is the idea of what the Durrington Walls looked like. Animals, mostly pigs and maybe sheep. They still at this time had wild aurochs they could hunt. And there was a big village, wattle and mud type of walls. And there was Woodhenge and Durrington Walls in the distance. And then the river Avon, and you see an avenue or cursus entry to this cluster. So this itself was a pilgrimage, religious, sacred site. This is, I think, one of the sad things about Woodhenge. It was known for a while, but to mark it, what they did is they buried stone, or not stone, but concrete poles to mark where the trees or the logs once stood. And so it's, to me, a kind of an anathema. They did attempt to reconstruct it in a few places, but it is not moving at all. That's what we kind of interpret it. The original thing almost looks like a maze behind this enormous henge. And you notice the ditch is on the inside. So this is the traditional way of building a henge, the ditch on the inside rather than on the outside, which it is at Stonehenge. So imagine, what was this for? A little causeway, maybe it was a maze, a spiritual maze, which are very, very often used in many places, including the California Indians used mazes as a purification thing. From excavations at Durrington Walls, they find lots and lots of, perhaps half of the meat eaten there was auroch, this massive precursor to the cow, and lots of suckling pigs. So they must have, since they were suckling young pigs, that meant that the celebrations were mostly midwinter when the pig hadn't finally grown. And the teeth of these pigs show a lot of decay, which sounds strange unless you figure out that maybe they were fed the mash of making, the residue of making beer in these beaker pots. So the poor pigs had decay, and then they were slaughtered, and hazelnuts and berries and all kinds of vegetables. So, and looking at some of the markers from the dental caries, some of these pigs and cattle that were brought down came all the way from Scotland, came down in winter for big celebrations. So this is another reconstruction with the frozen Avon River and the circus leading into Woodhenge, and then off in the distance part of the Durrington Wall and the village. How many people? Certainly up into 3,000 or 4,000 people who worked tirelessly at building these and then later Stonehenge. But this is about 1.5 miles from where Stonehenge stands. And one theory actually came from a stonemason in Madagascar who realized that the biggest stones were always the stones that were used for the dead. And so he says that Stonehenge was a way of honoring the dead. And so the Durrington area was a place to celebrate the living with feasts. Then you would take a boat down like you're journeying from life to death, walk up the avenue, and then celebrate your ancestors. So there is another avenue landing and the avenue leading you to the domain of the ancestors. Recently, right at the sharpest bend of the Avon River, in an area of marsh and spring and fen, archaeologists have been digging and found another village, but it is so kind of buried under the swamp. But it has lots of evidence of auric being killed in cattle and lots of flint napping. So this may be a precursor, maybe more 5,000 BC, before Stonehenge. Again, this is the whole layout with all actually a second cursus and all sorts of barrows throughout. One interesting thing that was found, the Amesbury Archer, who is clearly a beaker person because he's buried with 3 different bell beakers. He also has bronze knives and a beautiful bronze arrow points and gold hair doodads, and he was an archer with those beautiful arrow points. But he is clearly bell beaker. He did not build by the time he was there, Stonehenge was already up. So he may have used it as a religious or meeting spot. And the DNA in his bones said he came likewise from the Alps. So imagine in your lifetime in those days, traveling completely across Europe, getting across the English Channel, and ending up in this magical pilgrimage spot. And of course, it has long been a site of worship, whether Druidic, still Druidic. And one interesting thing is that from the get-go, people wanted to build their own version of it. So here is William Danby, who in the early 1800s had his laborers and farm workers build his own version of it. And it still stands in Yorkshire. And of course, who can forget Alliance, Nebraska? This was what else? Americans would build their own version of Carnhenge. This is in Alabama, made out of concrete. Mary's Hill, which is actually quite accessible along the, just across from the Dulles and on the Columbia River. This one's in Georgia. It's actually a kind of dolmen, and it has a Christian message in 6 language. And this is a rock park in Kentucky that has a form of Stonehenge. My favorite is in Myrtle Beach, made out of Old English telephone boxes. Texas, not to be outdone by England or not to be outdone by another Texan. There are 2 different versions of Stonehenge there. Western Australia has another version. And of course, this has attracted poets and celebrants and artists, and there's always an plein air showing of art that has been done here. Henry Moore, who actually was born in Yorkshire but spent a lot of time there sketching, did do an interpretive dolmen that's in Hyde Park, and then in his native Yorkshire put this other kind of interpretive dolmen in the sculpture garden there. If you want your own burial, this is a long burial, a long barrow that was built in 2014, and your ashes, for a small price, can be interred inside this enormous long barrow. For your interest and edification, the English are great walkers, and there's a wonderful trail system. It is possible to walk from the stone circle at Amesbury and walk to a number of places, the Kennet, Long Barrow, down to Durrington Walls, down to Stonehenge, and all the way down to Salisbury Cathedral. Now, unless you're at a long summer day, you're not going to do this in one day. It's about 20 some miles, but it's very easy to make a lodge, an inn reservation. Everything is well marked. They have great trail maps and even taped guides, and you walk near one of the white horses too, so you can see an awful lot the Amesbury stone circle, and having a chance to see everything of note in the Salisbury Plain. So it is a place of contemplation and a place of celebration, whatever they're celebrating, Celtic fantasies or Druidic notions or seasonal progression. People always celebrate whatever it is that makes us humans. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you at Oli again and hear your wonderful stories of travels, and I hope you get to see these places in the near future. Thanks for everything, and thanks so much to Michelle, who made all of this possible. Take care, stay well.